look, I'm really sorry that I can't be there in person to be part of such a fantastic panel of speakers and to be there personally at such an important event. And as you say, the blame is 100% on my side. The organisers had organised and ensured that I would be there in person, and that was my plan. But our government decided that they think by going for an early general election that they may steal a march on the opposition and hang on to the reins of power. So I, in my madness, have decided to contest that general election. I don't know if I'll succeed, but I do think, against the backdrop of an undermining of Irish neutrality and a massive encroachment of Ireland into the middle of an increasingly militarised European Union, that I have a responsibility to at least fly the flag in that regard. And I was thinking about the meeting here today, and I had done an interview on radio during the week announcing that I was standing. And I thought that was a pretty good place to start, because in the course of that meeting, I was making the points about the problems facing working class people in Ireland, the massive housing crisis, the cost of living crisis, the rent crisis. And the interviewer came in and went, yeah. But okay, do you still support Russia's war in Ukraine? And I thought, my God, are we still in this place 2 years into that war, that this type of truth manipulation continues? Because, of course, I never supported Russia's invasion of Ukraine. All of the votes in the European Parliament show, in fact, that I condemned it. But what I did do was say, while it may have been unjustified, it certainly was not unprovoked, and that NATO bore a huge responsibility for that war. And unless we understand that, then we can't hope to solve it. I went on to say to the presenter that I thought it was really ironic that when you argue for a ceasefire and a negotiated settlement in Ukraine, you're called a Putin puppet, a Kremlin stooge, or anything like that. But when you argue the same in relation to Palestine, nobody calls you a Netanyahu puppet or an Israeli stooge. And his reply to me on that was, yeah, but I mean, like, you probably mean that Israel should withdraw from Gaza. But in terms of Ukraine, any settlement is going to mean ceding land to Russia. Now, look, this is wrong on so many fronts that I take up the whole meeting trying to explain it. But first of all, he could look at the map, at the amount of land that Israel has stolen from the Palestinian people over decades, and nobody anywhere in the West ever suggested arming the Palestinians in order to liberate that land. I could and did make the point to him that a negotiated settlement, an agreement, means an agreement between two parties. And I'm not one of those parties. So any settlement wouldn't come about unless Ukraine agreed to that settlement. But isn't there a real irony in this? Because the truth is that any settlement which Ukraine gets now, 2 years into that war, which has seen hundreds of thousands dead, millions displaced, the ending of Ukraine as any sort of sovereign, independent country, because what the Russians haven't taken, the West have bought up. Out of that horror, yes, the deal that Ukraine will get now, thanks to their friends in the West, is probably going to be worse than what they would have got 2 years ago, when we also argued for a ceasefire and an end to hostilities there. And people say, well, how could you as an Irish person say that? And my answer is very clear. It's precisely because I'm an Irish person that I can say that. Because, and the reason I'm making this point is to expose the manipulation of opinion and the casualty that truth is in the conflict of war. Because the Irish peace agreement is lauded as one of the greatest achievements of international diplomacy, because people in Ireland aren't killing each other, and there is a pathway to a united Ireland. But yet, 17% of the island of Ireland is still occupied and controlled by Britain. But nobody calls that appeasement. That's a diplomatic marvel. Yet a similar arrangement for Ukraine is deemed to be appeasement. So what we're dealing with here, and I think it's really important in this session on endless war, is to call it out as it is. The manipulation of truth, the manipulation of information is such a key weapon of the political establishment and the military-industrial complex in waging their endless wars. Because nowhere in the media do we hear talk about how we end the horrors of war. Nowhere is there a dialogue about how our obligations under international law require us to resolve conflict by peaceful means. And nowhere is there a discussion about how the majority of people in the majority of countries around the world want peace and diplomacy. Now, our president, Michael D. Higgins, made the point that the military-industrial complex is the most dangerous organization on the planet, and I happen to very much agree with him in that regard. We know they have taken ownership of the media, and that's really important, and that's really important why you're all there today and why we're part of this conversation, because we have to develop our own truth and answer their lies. But we know that the political establishment has long been captured. We see it in the US now with the elections, so-called, when both sides have been bought and paid for by the arms industry. And he who pays the piper calls the tune. So we know that whoever gets elected in the US is going to dance to the tune of the military-industrial complex. I'm not even going to mention your own situation in Britain, whereby you get rid of a government and somehow manage to get something pretty similar like what went out before. But I will talk about Europe, where Europe is becoming increasingly like the US in terms of being captured by lobbyists and removed from the democratic accountability of its citizens. Because what we see now in Europe is our so-called defense policy being very much manipulated by the military-industrial complex. 10 years ago, the European leaders said, how are we going to make Europe safe? How will we do this? So they came up with an idea that they would ask the majority of representatives of the security and arms companies how that might come about. And surprise, surprise, the answer was, do you know what? The way you'll make yourself safe now is by investing a lot more in defence. And so it was that those who advised the European Union ended up in capturing the resources from that advice. And a massive splurge in military expenditure has taken hold of the European Union. We see now that for the first time there is a European Defence Fund, direct military expenditure from European budgets. And people may have seen that Draghi, in his wisdom, recently said that the answer to the European Union's failing competitiveness is an 800 billion per annum investment on mainly defence expenditure. Now, this is clearly lunacy. It's taking vital resources which could actually make people's lives better and secure in terms of dealing with housing, health, homelessness, tackling climate change. Resources are being diverted away into the pockets of the military-industrial complex. Now, a lot of people have said to me and pointed out the hypocrisy of the West in terms of their response to the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza. And there's certainly a lot of racism there in that response. But if you look at the detail, okay, fair enough. They're apoplectic about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Didn't seem to be that bothered now about the West's invasion of Afghanistan or Iraq or any of that sort of stuff. Well, we park that. So they're raging. And the Russians need to be expelled from the Olympics, from the World Cup, from the Eurovision. No such call for the Israelis. No bother them. Putin has to be hunted down before the ICC, but Bibi in Israel, Bibi's our friend. With 13 rounds of sanctions from the West and Europe in terms of Russia, and yet the favourable treatment of Israel continues, where directly 1 billion euros of European money goes to fund Israel, even in the midst of a genocide, not to mention the favourable EU Israel Trade Association, and so on. So people can see this. And people think that's terrible. They're being hypocritical. And they are being hypocritical. But the truth is, the only difference is their rhetoric. Their position on both of those conflicts is absolutely identical. In both Ukraine and in Gaza, they have actively opposed a ceasefire and have ensured the war has continued with US and European arms, full stop. And people can see that now for what it is. They couldn't care less about the people of Ukraine any more than they can with the people of Gaza. So I think as we meet here today, the words of Julian Assange in relation to the conflict in Afghanistan ring very true. When he said, the goal is to use Afghanistan to wash money out of the tax bases of the US and Europe through Afghanistan and back into the hands of a transnational security elite. The goal, he said, is endless war, not a winnable war. And I think you can replace Afghanistan there with Iraq, with Ukraine, with Gaza. It was ever so. But Gaza is a watershed after which things will never be the same again. And that's not because it's the first genocide, because sadly, of course, it isn't. But it is the first openly declared, publicly carried out genocide. It is horror beyond our imagination. And I'm not going to deal with the details of that because you know them. That's why you're here. But on a civilian population, it should know no end. And the reason it's happening is because Israel is a European settler colonial project. It was always held under a certain leash, but now that leash has been unraveled. And this is not accidental. And in my last few remarks, I'd say that the West is not accidentally bonfiring international law. They know exactly what they're doing. Israel is the vanguard in a new world order where the old days of might is right reign supreme. And that's what we've gathered here to call against and to organize against. And it may seem difficult, but the blinkers are off and people the world over can see Western colonialism and US empire for what it is. So that's why it's so important that you're here today. The strangleholds of the merchants of debt will not be beaten by politicians, but only by ordinary people organized, as you have done and are doing in the BDS movement, in direct action, in the protests. We are the majority and we will prevail. As Assange did say, if wars can be started by lies, peace can be started by the truth. That's what we're doing here today. I so wish I could have been there in person, but I'm with you in spirit and in my heart, and we will prevail because we are the majority and peace and justice is on our side.